Okay, so we're going to tackle our rose curves next. So rose curves are going to look like flowers, so they're kind of fun to draw. So rose curves are going to be in either the form A cosine in theta, or we're going to see a sine in theta. We're just going to focus on the cosine one right now. So how do you know if this is a rose curve versus a circle? Because it looks very similar. So for this to be a rose curve, this n value right here, there will be a number with theta. That's how you're going to know the difference, okay? So let me just give you an example. If this said r equals 4 cosine theta, this would be a circle. But if it says r equals 4 cosine 3 theta, that's going to be a rose curve. So only that difference is that number that's with the theta is going to tell you the difference between a circle and a rose curve. So be very careful, pay attention. Alright, there's a lot of little rules for rose curves. So I just have to kind of pay attention. So I'm just going to kind of go through these rules. So the first rule is that the absolute value of A is going to be the length of one petal. Okay, so think about we're drawing like a flower. Our petals, the length of them are going to be the absolute value of A, just like your diameter was on your circle. Okay, if n, and now n we're referring to is the number with theta, if n is odd, then there's going to be, that means there's going to be n petals. So if it's 5 theta, that means you're going to have 5 petals, okay? But if n is even, then you're going to have 2 n petals. So if n is 4, that's the even number, you're really going to have 8 petals, okay? So if it's an odd number, so once again, if you have 3 theta, that means you have 3 petals. But if you have 4 theta, that means you got to double it, so you really have 8 petals. Okay, so there's one thing. The next thing, so for number 4, radial lines. Radial lines tell you where the petals are going to go. So when we refer to radial lines, this is just where your petals are going to go. So some rules for this. One, it says one petal will lie along the polar axis. Okay, so polar axis is your x-axis. So if A is positive, then it's going to start at 0. So that means your first petal, like here, will be at 0. If A is negative, then your first petal is going to start at pi. Okay, so it has to either start at 0 or pi. If A is positive, it'll start at 0, so it'll start at the positive side. If it's negative, it'll start over here at pi. Then, to get the rest of your petals, you're going to get... So to get the rest of your petals, you're going, from your start, you're going to add 2 pi over the number of petals. So if you have 3 petals, you're going to put 2 pi over 3. That's what you're going to add. And you just add up until you have the number of petals that you're going to have. When you graph it, they should be evenly spaced out on your graph. So if you have one petal that's here, and then it jumps all the way down to here, and there's nothing in between, then you probably did something wrong. So just keep that in mind. You got to have a certain amount of petals. It should work out where it looks symmetric when you finish. Okay, so we're going to be writing a lot for these before I actually even graph, just so we can get all the information. So for our first example, we have r equals 3 cosine 3 theta. So first off, is this a circle or is this a rose curve? Well, because I have this 3 here, this has to be a rose curve. 3 theta makes it the rose curve. Okay, next thing I want to figure out is the length of the petals. So the length of the petals comes from the A value. The A value is that number out front, so the length of each petal is going to be 3. Okay. Next thing is the number of petals. So to figure out the number of petals, you're going to look at your n value, which is this 3 on the inside. Because n is odd, that means you're going to have 3 petals. Okay, if n was even, we would double it, but because it's odd, you don't have to. Last thing we need to figure out is where we're going to put our radial lines. In other words, where are our petals going to go in the unit circle? So because this was a positive 3 here, it said if A was positive, we're going to start at 0. And then to get our petals, we're going to add 2 pi over the number of petals. Well, we said we have 3 petals, so we're going to add 2 pi over 3. So our first petal is a 0. If you do 0 plus 2 pi over 3, you get 2 pi over 3. if I add another 2 pi over 3, same denominator, so we'll get 4 pi over 3. We'll see now we have 3 petals here, so those are our radial lines. That's where our petals are going to go. Alright, so bear with me as I try to graph this. But to do our petals, first off, you're always going to have a point in the middle of the pole. Okay. Our first petal says it's at 0, so here's 0. And our petals are length 3, so we're going to count over 3. And our first petal, it's going to go here. Something like that. Okay, it's going to look more like a petal. So there is our first place. Then, next one is going to be at 2 pi over 3. Okay, so think about your unit circle. It's really hard to see on my graph here, but 2 pi over 3 is the first thing here. So we're going to go from our dot we already have. We're going to count up to 3 because that's how long the petal is. And our next one is going to be at 2 pi over 3. So I'm going to draw in my petal. It should connect. That's a little bit better. There's the next petal. Then the last petal says it is at 4 pi over 3. So 4 pi over 3 in your unit circle is here. So we're going to count 3 spaces because our petals are length 3. And we're going to draw in our last petal. So while this is not perfect, it does kind of look like a flower. These are evenly spaced out. So we have drawn our rose curve correctly. Okay, let's take a look at the next one. Very similar. R equals 4 cosine of 2 theta. Okay, so first thing to figure out is what kind of shape. Well, because of this 2 here, we know this has to be a rose curve and not a circle. Okay, so next thing is the length of the petals. So the length of your petals comes from your A value. The A value is 4, so each petal is going to be a length of 4. Then we want to figure out the number of petals. Okay, so we're looking at our N value here. The N value is an even number this time. If it's even, remember you have to double it. So because this is 2, we are going to actually have 4 petals. And then the last part we have to figure out is the radial lines, which is where do these petals go? Okay, so because A is positive, it tells us we're going to start at 0. Remember, if A would have been negative, we would have started at pi. We're going to start at 0. And we're going to add 2 pi over the number of petals. Well, if you look here, we said we have 4 petals this time, not 3. So we're adding 2 pi over 4. Or if you want to simplify and think pi over 2, you can do that. Okay? So, to get our radial lines, the first one's at 0. The next one we're going to add pi over 2, so it'll be pi over 2. If we add another pi over 2, we're going to end up at pi. Now we have 1, 2, 3, we got to have 4. If we add another pi over 2, we're going to end up at 3 pi over 2. So we should have 4 petals, 1, 2, 3, 4. They should be evenly spread out. Starting at 0, we added 2 pi over 4 because that's the number of petals, which was really pi over 2. So let's see how we can draw this one. Okay, so we always have a point in the middle at the pole. Our first petal's at 0, and it says that it has a length of 4. So I counted over 4 spaces, and we're going to draw in our petal. There's our first petal. Next one is pi over 2, which is up here, and remember we had to count up 4 spaces, so it would be there. So we can draw in our petal. There's the next one. Then we have a petal at pi, so at pi we're going to count over 4 spaces. So then our next petal, here. And then our last petal is at 3 pi over 2, and it's 4 spaces. So our last petal should go here. It really should be that skinny. But, so you get the gist of that. So, guys, look at my notes online if you want to see the better drawing of these pictures. But they are evenly spaced out, and we have our points, so we know that that's what you were trying to draw with the petals. And, so that is a rose curve. So far for the rose curves, you have a lot of information that I have to tell: the number of petals, length of the petals. The radial lines is probably the trickiest part. Just have to make sure you start at the right place and make sure you're adding 2 pi over the number of petals, not just n, but the number of petals. Alright, so we'll do the sine one in hopefully the next one will be the last video.